Protecting patents and patients. The fight between global pharmaceutical companies and the drug makers copying their products. Who's winning the battle in a billion-dollar industry pitting profits against provision for the poor? This is Inside Story. Hello, warm welcome to the programme with me, David Foster. India's top court has rejected an application from the Swiss drug maker Novartis to protect an updated version of an old cancer drug. Novartis was seeking to renew the patent of the drug Gilvec in a process known as evergreening. Well, AIDS groups have welcomed the court's decision. Doctors Without Borders warned that victory for the pharmaceutical company would have limited access to important medicines for millions of poor people around the world. Sohail Rahman has more from New Delhi.
India makes many drugs as generic drugs and markets them to South America and Africa. It's a leading market contender when it comes to that. And so having this judgment go in favour of the Indian pharmaceutical companies will now raise questions about whether Western pharmaceutical companies will want to sell their original products in India for fear of them being copied, and whether there is a happy medium where Western pharmaceutical companies could work together with Indian pharmaceutical companies to make a cheaper product that both benefit from financially. It is now in the realm of the international lawyers and the World Trade Organization who've been watching this case very carefully. We expect Novartis to appeal again against this decision. It's early days, but certainly for the moment, Indian pharmaceutical companies have scored a very valuable win in the Supreme Court, and more so, cancer sufferers across the globe can certainly breathe a sigh of relief for the moment that cheaper generic drugs will still be available from Indian manufacturers.
Well, Novartis is clearly disappointed by the decision in India's Supreme Court. We brought this case because we strongly believe patents safeguard innovation and encourage medical progress, particularly for unmet medical needs. It's a ruling that is a setback for patients that will hinder medical progress for diseases without effective treatment options. Well, Rajeshwari Hariharan is a lawyer for Natco Pharma, which is an Indian pharmaceutical company committed to manufacturing affordable medicine. Well, she says the Supreme Court's decision is a positive step and will ensure the right drugs will get to those who need them.
Indian companies will be making a version of this drug which is very cheap. The Indian companies have the technology, and if a drug is off patent, then its benefit should go to the patients. And that's the thinking which has been brought in through the amendments which the Indian government made in 2005, and that thinking has now been validated by the Supreme Court's decision. In fact, if you see the laws of Brazil, even of US and Europe, it is quite difficult to get a patent for a polymorph. It is like saying, now there is a pill which is now pink in color and give me a patent. It's very difficult to get a patent like that in many other countries. It's a strategy to extend the life cycle of an expired drug, which is not encouraged in any country of the world. So India's laws, which have been made after 2005, are in consonance with TRIPS. There is nothing which is deviating from TRIPS. So I think this judgment validates the thinking of the government, and it is a step in the right direction.
OK, let's get more on this. Our guests are from Geneva, Aziz-ur-Rehman, who's policy advisor for Doctors Without Borders, and in our Washington studios, James Love, Director of Knowledge Ecology International, a specialist on intellectual property policy. Let's go to Geneva first. And if I could ask you, Mr. Rehman, we're not just talking here about cancer drugs. That happens to be the one that's been involved in this court case, but a whole stable of different pharmaceuticals. Would they have been developed at all were it not for the billions of research dollars that companies such as Novartis were prepared to put in the first place?
Yeah, thanks for your question. I think that this judgment today coming from Indian Supreme Court, this is really it's a landmark decision, and it's a good decision for millions of patients, not just in India, but all over the world. On this question, that what would be the impact of this particular decision on pharmaceutical research and innovation, let me put it in this way, that this decision, today's decision, is not about all kind of patents. So if there are some really innovative and new drugs and innovations, they are still patentable, and today's decision has nothing to do with that. And in India, even those patents are granted. So in this case, we are actually talking about those kind of patent applications.
But let me put it this way. If
Yeah.
a company knows that somebody else is going to come in and effectively steal their idea, they're not going to want to go in there in the first place and do the necessary research and development that initially produces life-saving drugs.
No, it is not like that. If you see the whole patent system and the way it works in the area of pharmaceuticals, when the initial substances they are developed, the patents are filed on that. So, and later on, number of secondary patents are filed on those on the same drug and the same substance, and with the main objective to keep the life cycle alive and to prolong the life cycle of that particular product. So that is really problematic, because if you continue like that, then you will charge higher prices from the consumers and patients, and that is not something very helpful, especially in developing and least developing countries.
OK, I'm going to come back to you in just a moment and explore all this a little bit more. But let's go to James Love, who's in Washington, D.C. for us. And perhaps you could start by explaining why India is so different to many other countries in the world where there are patents, because this particular drug, Gilvec, it's been granted patents in, I think, 40 other countries, but as we see, not in India.
Well, a lot of this has to do with when the research was done on this particular drug, because there was a change in the patent status in India as they transitioned from a country that didn't grant patents on pharmaceutical products to when they did. And they tried to actually get a monopoly in India on this particular drug by using some, even though they couldn't patent the original compound because it was too old. They tried to get some more recent patents on different formulations of the product, and they tried to use that as a way of extending the monopoly in India. India, by the way, has...
Is it that India, which MSF, Médecins Sans Frontières, describes as the pharmacy of the developing world, is it that India wants to protect a massive business for itself, with all of these other drugs companies producing what are known as generics, which are effectively exact copies of other drugs, that it wants to protect this industry for itself, whereas other countries which allow the pharmaceuticals to get patents don't have that industry and have no need to do so?
Well, I think you just have to pay attention to what the Supreme Court did. You may think India has bigger issues, but this particular decision was much narrower than that. This has to do with whether or not you can extend the monopoly on a product beyond the first 20 years. India does grant patents on new pharmaceutical drugs for 20 years. The question is, at 20 years start running, can they come in and can they continue to, like for example in the United States, Abbott Pharmaceuticals has a patent on putting this drug ritonavir, an AIDS drug, into a gel tab, as if that's some kind of great innovation. I mean, it's one thing to develop a new drug, it's another thing to put the active ingredient into a new formulation or a different dose or something. So what the India decision is not whether or not you grant patents on new drugs. And it shouldn't be portrayed like that by you or anyone else. It's really a decision about whether or not you can extend the patent beyond the first 20 years for a new product. And that's what the court has rejected in this case. India, by the way, has per capita income of 3% of the United States. And it's also the case that 90% of the early R&D on this particular drug was done by nonprofit organizations in the United States.
Well, let's talk about this in just a moment. Go through some of the few facts and figures that we have been able to put together. Pharmaceutical companies, which we've been referring to, well, they do spend billions of dollars on research and development. R&D and patents are vital for protecting what they produce. Usually protecting sales, as we've been hearing, of a drug for about 20 years. Once a patent expires, though, other companies do jump in and make cheaper copies of the original. A lot at stake. In the next 5 years, prescription drugs with combined annual sales of $290 billion are expected to lose their patent protection. And here's what can happen. Take Pfizer, its cholesterol-lowering drug Lipitor, Annual sales of Lipitor peaked at $13 billion. But despite Pfizer's best efforts to protect one of its biggest money spinners, sales dropped by half in the first week it went off patent at the end of 2011. But for the Indian copycat makers, let's call them that, Ranbaxy Laboratories, this was a watershed, making $500 million selling their version of Lipitor in just the first 6 months. Mr. Raymond, try and explain to us how this will affect people in India who need this life-saving drug. How will they be able to access it now that this company no longer has the patent on the drug?
Obviously, in this particular case, when there are no patents, there would be a generic competition, not just from one company, but from more than one companies, and the prices would come down. And in fact, the prices in India are already low because the drug is the generic version of this drug, they are already in the market. And this is the whole point, and this is the whole rationale of a sort of patent bargain, because once a drug is on patent, its prices are high because there is a monopoly source of supply. But once there are no patents or the drugs get off patent, the prices come down because of generic competition. So Indian patients, and not just the Indian patients.
Do you believe Novartis and other drugs companies are systemically greedy in this regard because they're providing the drugs for so much more money than the generic companies can, the copiers can? Do you believe that it's simple greed in this case?
I think that this is the problem is with the whole systematic framework of the research and development incentives right now in the area of pharmaceutical and biomedical research. The prevailing model right now is intellectual property and patent-based model, and we really question this model because this model has failed both on innovation front and also on access front. And all companies which are actually relying overwhelmingly on this model, they are facing this kind of problem, the kind of question which say whether they are greedy or they are not greedy. I don't want to go into that detail, but the issue is that the whole issue of pharmaceutical research and development and the alternative incentive models, that should be actually the main issue of the consideration, not only for the civil society, the governments, but also for big pharmaceutical companies like Novartis.
Okay, let's take a look at what happens elsewhere, because a lot of HIV and AIDS drugs are copied in India, they're then moved on elsewhere. It doesn't necessarily guarantee that these cheaper drugs are always available where they're needed. We're going to go to South Africa just now, where, among others, Archbishop Desmond Tutu signed an MSF petition calling on Novartis to drop this court case. But we go there now, and our correspondent Tanya Page, she's in Soweto on a project that I know Doctors Without Borders, MSF, is involved with. This is what she has.
This is Chris Hani Baragwanath Hospital in Soweto. It's the biggest in the country and a major treatment centre for HIV/AIDS patients. Médecins Sans Frontières says India is the world's biggest supplier of generic antiretrovirals, or ARVs, to help treat the virus. But South Africa is a relatively low consumer of generics. That's why Médecins Sans Frontières and the Treatment Action Campaign say prices for medicines here are just far too high. They say that's particularly a problem for cancer treatment because the drugs are developed so quickly and they're so specific. MSF and the Treatment Action Campaign have joined forces to try and help fight the high price of medicines here. They say the blame lies with the fact that at the moment, the big pharmaceutical companies are allowed to take out multiple patents for a single drug. It means that when one patent expires, another automatically takes its place. They want the government to form a patent examiner's office to scrutinise each and every patent in the hope that they'll be able to break the monopolies of the big pharmaceutical companies.
OK, Mr. Love in Washington, D.C. That was Tanya Page in South Africa. Just trying to broaden the whole debate out so that it's not just about India, it's about other countries where drugs can be outlandishly expensive. If we talk about the Indian companies that are making these generics, these copycats, exact replicas, whatever, their costs are so much lower. Are they capable of making the same sort of profit, albeit with drugs cheaper at the end of the day for the patients, but are they likely to make the same sort of profit as a big pharmaceutical company? Are they in it for the money or the altruism?
Well, I think that the generic drug companies and the R&D intensive companies, all these companies, whether they're big or they're small, they're profit-making companies, and they're not really motivated by much other than that for the most part. I mean, there's some exceptions around the margin, but in the core, these companies are just out trying to make a buck. Now, consumers are poor people, or the public in general benefits from competition among companies, and everything depends on the rules. If you grant the monopoly, you can have high prices. The problem is the drug companies are charging extremely high prices for cancer drugs. These are drugs that, since it's such a severe illness, there's just, people are really quite desperate. I'll just give you an example that I face. My wife right now pays $7,861 every 21 days for an injection of Herceptin, which is a cancer drug. And she has to take that indefinitely. Now, those are just the prices of new cancer drugs for breast cancer. They're claiming now are going to be $15,000 a month in another year or two when they change the standard of care. I just don't see how you really think that people can really afford that. And if they charge those kind of prices in developing countries, it just means that most people that have cancer in developing countries are not going to have the drugs.
But what do you make
in a lot of cases that means they're going to die.
Now, these points that are put up. Sorry to jump in. What do you make of these points?
Sure.
When it comes to its social conscience, Novartis says its total donations to try and help cure leprosy, principally in India, where most cases are, will reach $100 million. A new 5-year program will be $22.5 million, money it gives away, and it will reach 850,000 patients worldwide. These companies do put something back into the community, don't they?
Well, actually, the donation programs are really interesting because the United States government grants them a what they call an enhanced donation, or an enhanced deduction rather, on donations of medical products like that. So the companies actually are allowed to deduct twice the cost of goods when they make those kind of donations in India and other countries. And so it's actually subsidized by the U.S. taxpayers, these donation programs. I think that, that at the end of the day, the whole system of granting monopolies to encourage R&D, it doesn't work in a country with this huge of differences of income between developing countries and high-income countries, or even really nowadays it barely works even in the richest countries on earth, in England or the United States. And so I think a lot of people think you have to have a different business model for drug development based on the delinkage of the R&D cost from the product prices, that you can no longer expect high drug prices to be the be-all and end-all of financing innovation.
Yeah, we invited comments from those following us on Facebook. Here are some of the suggestions that came to us, some pretty strong comments. Vivian Bosina writing, what is the point of developing these, quote, life-saving drugs if they are not made accessible to some of the people who need it most? And Shiram Ramanujam tells us, Supreme Court of India has served justice and hope for thousands, if not millions, of cancer patients. This should be a lesson to all drugs companies. Don't mess with people's lives. But Emma Nectar Newell adds, with the elimination of profit, innovations and inventions of drugs will be set back. Therefore, policymakers should come up with a position which supports accessibility to such drugs cheaply and also encourage further inventions and innovations. And if I can add just one more that I happened to spot when I was taking a look at a website today, a website which incidentally actually put Novartis as the number one in terms of drug companies worldwide by reputation. This was the quote put on there. I'll come to you in just a moment, Mr. Raymond, to comment on this. Patients are seen as long-term customers. The longer they're kept alive, the more outlandishly expensive monthly payments can be squeezed out of them to pay executives. I talked there about some of the projects that Novartis is involved in, with leprosy, for example. Are we talking simply about profit? Are we talking about a desire to actually come up with the right life-saving drugs? What are we looking at here when we look at pharmaceuticals?
Actually, when we look at pharmaceuticals right now, the biggest issue is that how the people, especially the poor people all around the world, they can access those treatments which they really need. This is a basic question, and this is the bottom line. Now, there are a number of constraints and number of limitations in this regard. The patents and the patent-related practices that play a very important role as a sort of barrier. So, and that's why we are talking about that, and it has become a big issue in the context of this case in India. And the kind of donations and number of other programs which companies like Novartis and other pharmaceutical companies they are running, they are per se something good, something which should be appreciated. But the issue is not just confined to this particular drug or a couple of other drugs. The issue is more systematic, that how new patents should be granted on drugs or certain formulations of drugs or combinations of drugs which are just part of the already existing knowledge or the prior art. And here comes the decision that those kind of practices should be discouraged and those should not be allowed.
Do you know whether the World Trade Organization, our correspondent mentioned this, whether the World Trade Organization can do anything about this? What will its stance be?
Yeah, World Trade Organization in this case, because when this case was at High Court level, one of the pleas of the Novartis was that the Indian law, a particular provision in Indian law, that is Section 3D, that is against the requirement of one of the agreements of the World Trade Organization, that is the TRIPS agreement, deals with the intellectual property standard and norms. And the Indian High Court did not agree on this, and Novartis went into the Supreme Court, and now this case is rejected from the Supreme Court. Now, of course, Novartis cannot directly go and cannot directly approach to the World Trade Organization. So it depends on individual member state. If a member state like United States or any other member state, they decide to go and ask question about the validity of relevant Indian patent law in WTO, then of course that would be a possibility. But we hope that is not going to happen. We think on the face of it, Indian patent law, with all its amendments after 2000, especially the amendments of 2005, all of them, they are legal, they are quite sound, and they are within the purview of internationally accepted intellectual property law interpretations.
Mr. Love in Washington, D.C., I want to read out something about Novartis and its former chairman, Daniel Vasella, guy who quit towards the end of the year. He conceded he'd made a mistake in agreeing to a $78 million farewell, a payoff to leave the company. $78 million. In the end, he turned it down. But what does that say about the pharmaceuticals company's understanding of the real world, the world in which their patients live?
Well, at the CEO level, it just bears no relationship to ordinary people's lives. But if you can't look out in the world and realize that if the majority of the world's population cannot afford your products, there's a problem, then you're just never going to understand why these decisions come up. You mentioned earlier this problem about the WTO. Switzerland, the United States, and the European Union have decided not to challenge the Indian patent law, which has been around since 2005, because they thought they would lose if they brought it to a WTO case. So I think that the suggestion that India is operating outside of the global norms is undermined by the fact that nobody is really bringing them to the WTO. Novartis has been super aggressive on this case, and if you spend much time in India, you just can't possibly imagine that these companies can justify the really high prices that they charge in that country for drugs for cancer and things.
But the companies that are making the generics, the copycat drugs, are they just as unrealistic, perhaps?
Well, the generic companies that provide the Indian market, they also supply the European and the United States market. Most of the drugs that are sold in the United States or Europe, a large fraction of those are actually manufactured in FDA-approved plants in India and exported to Europe and the United States. So they have a high-quality generics industry and highly competitive in India. Now, at the end of the day, this problem of R&D versus access, it has to be resolved, but it has to be resolved in a way that doesn't give up one goal at the expense of the other. And it has to recognize the fact that incomes are different in different parts of the world, and everybody's life is equally important. So I think that you just got to get away from the grant of monopolies, which leads to these high prices, and you have to develop things like these innovation inducement prize programs and things like that, which allow you to de-link the cost of R&D from the prices of the new drugs.
Well, we thank you very much indeed for that. James Love in Washington, D.C. May we on the programme wish your wife a speedy and as full as possible recovery. And in Geneva, as is Raymond, thank you to our viewers for joining us on this edition of Inside Story. If you want to send us your feedback, email your thoughts to insidestory@aljazeera.net. From me, David Foster, and the rest of the team, thanks for watching. See you next time.